I'm supposed to start out by talking about my cannabis journey. My journey's been kind of interesting because I started out in the entertainment industry, forming the American Film Institute's Digital Media Studies program. My first job in the movie business was working with James Cameron on a movie called The Abyss, and then I worked with Michael Crichton for 20 years and worked on movies like Jurassic Park and wrote some movies with him and edited a lot of his novels. But I had a kind of migraine headache called hemiplegic migraine, and they're really nasty because you can get mild paralysis, numbing. They're horrible. And the problem is that the existing migraine medicines at the time put me at risk for stroke. And two of my younger siblings have had strokes, so that made that medicine kind of a non-starter. And my neurologist recommended cannabis to me, and I hadn't used cannabis since college. And so I tried it, and I used it as prophylaxis to reduce the frequency of headaches, based on some ideas from Ethan Russo, who later became a colleague. And it worked for me. It reduced the frequency of my migraine auras, reduced the frequency of progression of auras to headaches, really improved my life. So I thought, wow, this is the coolest thing ever, and there's nothing out there about this. So I'm going to go find out about it, because I'd researched with Crichton for years, and I could dive into most subjects. And so I went and asked questions, and nobody had any answers. You go to these dispensaries in California, the early ones, and you're lucky if you got sativa and indica, or if you got that, whether they could pronounce it. And nobody knew anything. And I'm happy to say that we know a little bit more today. There's a long way to go. There's a lot of speculation in my book. I've had to extrapolate a lot of preclinical to its potential application in humans. I'm trying to be a little bit conservative about it and not hurt people. I'm kind of harsh on certain things like the use of cannabis by pregnant women because the endocannabinoid system is so clearly deeply involved in neurodevelopment, in everything from the embryo through children, through adolescence into young adulthood. I am concerned about high doses of THC, and I think that the worst guidance currently in the industry is that people do not recommend the use of CBD as a seatbelt for THC, when the brain scanning evidence is very clear that we need more CBD to protect people from the side effects of long-term chronic use of THC. And you don't hear about that enough. And the reason you don't hear about that enough is that there is an enormous amount of ignorance that is kind of soaked into this industry based around what I call the patchouli on the industry, which is this idea that, oh man, it's a plant, it's a plant. And that pervades a lot of thinking that it, just because it's an herbal medicine, it doesn't have, can you help me turn that back on? Thank you. Yeah, I'm a fidgeter, and that's the wrong thing for me to hold. It's like click, 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 and I see behind me the slides going like this. But the basic thing, my cannabis journey was this. I wanted to find out how this stuff worked, how to make it safer, how to dose it, how to administer it, and because of the nature of the chemistry of cannabis, this is really challenging, okay? It's not simple. Vaporizers are weird devices. We believe they're the safest method of pulmonary administration of cannabis, but as you can see, people will color outside of the lines with this, and they'll put, lipids into these things like, vitamin E acetate or other things, and those things are not meant to be raised to the temperature to which they're being raised and inhaled. And, I remember arguing with people about using PG in vapes. And I said, that doesn't look safe. And they said, oh, no, it's the only FDA-approved, one of these things for inhalation. I mean, it's approved by the FDA. I said, no, it's not. It's approved at low temperature for inhalation. when you heat this stuff up, it turns into all kinds of nasty things that you probably should not be inhaling. And so today, we're stuck in really starting to examine our choices as far as administration. The reason that we don't have consistent oral cannabis medicines is there's a wide variation in how they get into the bloodstream. And that's why they were kind of abandoned by a lot of the pharmaceutical companies in the 1930s. In 1935, Lilly had 36 cannabis medicines in their catalog. They were trying to develop cannabis americana as a counter to cannabis indica, because all of the cannabis that was coming in were tinctures and extracts from Indian cannabis. And so Lilly had a little farm in Indiana breeding cannabis. And today, Lilly denies that. What's really funny is they denied it until I uncovered the thesis that Eli Lilly Jr. wrote at the Pharmacy College of Philadelphia in his handwriting and signed by his father, that's studying cannabis in dogs. And that's what he wrote his undergraduate thesis on. And so we actually do have a history with this plant that goes way back, and it's really fascinating. And I'm not a big conspiracy guy, but certain companies don't want that dragged into the light, and Lilly being one of them. Park Davis was a huge manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. And I think these things can be studied as medicines, but I also think they can be used by adults if the dose guidance that's given is good. But today, the dose guidance for cannabis is how much can the person withstand, all right? Because it goes back to this kind of frat boy mentality of, oh, you're not a big enough dude to take a big bong. But that actually shows up at the counter at many dispensaries where people give bad advice on dosing cannabis products. I was standing in a dispensary in Venice, California, and this older woman, probably in her early 70s, came in and was cannabis naive, had never used it. The guy behind the counter recommended a 70 milligram edible to her. Yeah, I wonder what that was like when she was like painting the walls of her house with mustard about 11 o'clock at night. And the reason I bring up the mustard analogy is I actually had a physician come into a Sacramento dispensary and was given a 50 milligram cookie that she was told was a sample and not medicated. And she ate the whole thing in the car on the way home and painted her living room with mustard. Okay, I know, because I got the call from her while she was doing it, because the dispensary called me and said, do you think there's a chance that she actually took a medicated cookie? She's painting her living room with mustard. Yeah, there's a chance. So anyway, we have to give better dose guidance. And so my big message on that front, and I'll get into the meat of this, when I got into cannabis, I thought I knew 70% of what I needed to know about cannabis and how to use it. Today, I'm very convinced I know about 5%, and that number's going down, but my knowledge base is expanding radically. We're finally getting a real flood of research, and a lot of the research is really easy to understand if you're fluent in the topic, and so things are only getting better. I wrote the book Cannabis Pharmacy basically because I was trying to translate the work of these 4 people for the average reader. And that was Ethan Russo, neurologist, John McPartlin, a DO from a neighboring state, Vermont, and Robert Connell Clark, who wrote Marijuana Botany, and I had edited his latest book, which was Cannabis Evolution and Ethnobotany, and then Vincenzo DiMarzo, who I think is the current bright light in endocannabinoid science. He's at Laval up in Quebec, and he's the brightest guy in the field right now. If you want to really go into a deep dive into endocannabinoid function, he's the best guide I've found so far. He's really, really, really knows this stuff. And then I kind of expanded my knowledge base with the help of some Russian hacker friends who helped me get access to papers I couldn't afford, and UCLA professors, in particular Sander Greenland, who wrote the textbook Modern Epidemiology, and holds the Wishal Indian record for taking the most peyote buttons. He's a really interesting guy. And, and then Never enough toner. I became obsessed with printing out papers. And it got so bad that actually the company I was working with came to us and said, you know, you spent $2,500 last year on toner. You have to stop this. Just keep them. We'll buy you a bigger hard drive. Just keep them in electronic form. And then this is the biggest problem in cannabis right now. It's very, very hard to describe something that's moving as quickly as this is. And so you have to get very, very comfortable with being wrong. And I am insanely comfortable with being wrong. People come up to me and go, I found this problem in your book. I go, trust me, I found it before you did. I mean, when I look at people praise my book and I look at it and go, oh gosh, I can't wait to do the next revision. But I know the second I finish the next revision, I'll just keep finding mistakes. And that's just the way it's going to be. Currently, the people who are helping me a lot, Dr. Andrew Weil, who runs the Weil School of Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona Medical School, Jack McHugh, who was a clinical professor of medicine at UC San Francisco for decades. Jack's my medical editor, and he's really good. He's a great doctor. And then the big thing was I really wanted to find out what these strains were, okay? Because when the group I was with built a $2 million chemistry lab, not to test for dispensaries, but to test our cultivation. And so we ran 18,000 tests on different batches of cannabis that we cultivated. And we had a gigantic collection of germplasm. From a chemistry standpoint, probably 4,200 distinct chemotypes, but distinct in very, very small ranges. The truth is there are not that many types of cannabis growing today. There are just a lot of names for them. And there are subtle differences, and some of those are epigenetic and environmental. Others have to do with as far as environment go, whether it's grown indoors or outdoors. The chemistry changes dramatically when you go indoors to outdoors. And one thing that I hope this state does is make it easier for dispensaries to cultivate their medicine under full sunlight, because it turns on a lot of genes that you can't reproduce without a lot of difficulty under artificial lighting, though LED lights are changing that. Endocannabinoid system, it's brand new. Most doctors never studied it in school. Most doctors today are not studying it. It's a very, very complex system. It's incredibly difficult to get a handle on. Demarzov does the best job. He doesn't even call it the endocannabinoid system anymore. He calls it the endocannabinoid dome. And the reason is all these TRP receptors, these thermoreceptors, are probably endocannabinoid receptors as well. And so now the latest thinking is that there is a CB1 receptor. THC primarily regulates that. I'm talking about exogenous ligands now. A CB2 receptor, a beta-caryophyllene, the terpene, is the most efficient ligand for it. And then CB3, which used to be TRPV1, and that's myrcene. So myrcene, the most common terpene produced by cannabis plants, seems to be a really decent agonist for CB3. CB3 regulates certain kinds of pain signaling. So our understanding of myrcene and THC together in pain, or myrcene and CBD together in pain, or some interesting combination with beta-caryophyllene, starts to point us in the direction of the future of phytocannabinoid medicine, all right? Because these are really interesting. Now, the problem with myrcene is it's really hard to keep it around. When you process cannabis, myrcene is the first thing that disappears. If you just put dried cannabis on a shelf for 46 days, half your myrcene is going to be gone. And I've done those shelf stability tests, and you don't hear about this stuff. What you don't hear about is the chemistry of cannabis products when they get on the shelf and when they stay on the shelf. And I view cannabis as a very perishable medicine. But the street doesn't agree with me, and I don't care, because in this case, the street is wrong, all right? I've done the shelf stability testing on these things, and you have to take care of them, or they don't hang out, okay? Now, some things hang out. Beta-caryophyllene will be in cannabis till the end of time. Apparently, it's quite at home there, and it's not going to move, because when you extract cannabis, there's beta-caryophyllene. If you leave it on their shelf for 5 years, there's beta-caryophyllene. That stuff is really sturdy, all right? But other things like myrcene, pinene, limonene, these are very delicate compounds. Terpinolene and osamine are incredibly delicate compounds. And we just need a better understanding of how to make these things hang out so they can be part of the entourage that we use. So now I'll get to entourage. I think we're in the entourage business. We're looking at the synergies and interactions of a group of phytochemicals and how they work on aspects of human physiology. And because the endocannabinoid system, because the endocannabinoids are produced locally when they're needed, typically, and then immediately metabolized for the most part, this is a really interesting dance, and it's why pharma has really had a hard time, because pharma likes magic bullets, and often the action of those magic bullets is systemic. And the problem with that is if you have an enzyme that breaks down an endocannabinoid like FA, and you try to mess with it and make it into a patentable pharma thing, you can end up like Bial, the Portuguese pharmaceutical company, did, and kill people in a clinical trial because it turned their brains into Swiss cheese, because the pharmaceutical was not working in a selective, specific manner exactly where they wanted it to work. It worked more broadly, and these people's brains started bleeding. And obviously, not a good thing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how to take a plant medicine that's going to work systemically and get it to work effectively and safely without pushing the envelope too much to the point where we could injure somebody. Now, I don't really think cannabis is going to injure many people, but it will do one thing, and that is if you take high doses of THC, it will selectively downregulate the CB1 receptor. We don't know what that means long term, okay? There's no evidence to indicate what happens if you selectively downregulate CB1 for a long time. And CB1 is expressed all over the brain, and this could be problematic. For example, if you selectively downregulate, we notice that CB1, we notice that you impair memory and learning in the hippocampus. We thought for a while that might be permanent because Nora Volkow done a study at NIH that indicated that after 28 days, the brain reset and the expression of CB1 came back if the person wasn't using cannabis, except in the hippocampus. And then these Australian folks did the same experiment, but they extended it. And they found that it did come back after 6 months. All right? So the good news is you can get a reset of your endocannabinoid system. But the thing in the Australian study that was really interesting was people who used CBD at the same time as THC didn't have that problem. Their hippocampuses, the volume of their hippocampus at least, was indistinguishable from people who'd never used cannabis at all. And this gets back to my fundamental point. Some of these compounds work as seatbelts for other compounds. Certain compounds that are really promising today that I've worked with are awful. Like, I'm not a fan of THCV. A lot of people think, oh, THCV, it's the future, the Lamborghini of cannabinoids. No, it's the beat-up truck you bought from your neighbor that breaks down in the middle of a snowstorm. THCV is of very little interest to me. GW Pharmaceuticals has already blown millions of dollars trying to find something it'll work with, and they don't really have any results to show so far. And I don't think it's the future. So just because it's the new shiny thing in cannabis doesn't mean it's going to be the next big deal in cannabis. It may be sold to you that way, but it won't be that way. Read Vincenzo Di Marzo, and you'll understand all of this. That's all I have to tell you, basically, about this slide, all right? He was one who said that the endocannabinoid regulates how we relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. He's probably expanded that by about 5 words now. But it's really important because it's obviously involved deeply in these things, from how cancers form in your body to how cancer cells are killed, immunity, inflammation, all kinds of interesting things. But those 4 compounds I talked about, and I'd probably add CBG to it too. CBG, THC, CBD, beta-caryophyllene, and myrcene are the most promising compounds in cannabis right now. They're really, really interesting. This is a great map from Di Marzo about how this worked. I modified this to have a few other things. I put where myrcene's working, where beta-caryophylene's working. But it shows you all the different pathways that the body uses to make endocannabinoids and break them down. It's not the same everywhere in the body. And so just thinking we're going to figure out cannabis is a little hard. Most interesting right now is how the endocannabinoid system works in our gut with our microbiome to communicate to the brain and influence mood, influence metabolic disease like diabetes, schizophrenia, some really interesting topics. And this is the latest and greatest. This is what's emerging right now. These are all the compounds. If we start to look at the potential of the plant, type 1 genetics produce THC, type 2 genetics produce THC and CBD, type 3 genetics produce CBD. CBD alone. And then there are type 4 genetics that produce a lot of the propylcannabinoids like THCV, CBDV. CBDV is really interesting. It's just really hard to find right now. I use a vape pen full of CBDV, and it's a really, really interesting drug. Number one, it's psychoactive, unlike CBD, and it's got a very, very different effect than THC. And I think it's going to be a very interesting product for pain long term. We'll find out. Terpenes, this is my current understanding of how these work. There are a lot of window pane terpenes that don't do anything. They contribute flavor and fragrance, but they're not really that pharmacologically active. These people who take, these lists of terpenes and what they do, they're taking preclinical evidence at incredibly high doses, and they're saying that that's what these terpenes do. It's nonsense, all right? The really active terpenes are like here to here, okay? And like terpinolene is associated with a sativa effect because it doesn't do anything. You're just feeling the THC, okay? So if you took pure THC and terpinolene, you basically just feel the THC, all right? But our understanding of this is highly skewed by people who are trying to provide the answer so fast that they provide nonsense. Okay, so what's the point? The point is this. You're only as good as your lab, all right? And your lab is only as good as your lab. So you gotta be really picky about your lab. We'll have somebody from a good lab talk today, but labs are tough to run. They're tough to run commercially, all right? Like if I spent $2 million on my lab and I have a suite of great instruments from Agilent, Waters, PerkinElmer, I'm set, okay, if I'm just testing my products. But if I'm trying to test for a bunch of companies and they're on it, they need to know fast, that often results in some level of compromise. Now, it doesn't have to be fatal compromise, but it's tough to do. And so you gotta make sure that whoever tests the testers is doing a really good job, so that you know that the data you're getting is solid and you can rely on it and you can tell other people, and it can help manufacturers dial in their products so they're consistent, okay? I mean, I've cultivated enough cannabis now that what you notice is if you get control of your environmental inputs, your epigenetic influencers, and you keep your plants really happy. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I can walk into a room where cannabis is growing, and I can tell the mood of the plants, at least as far as how they're doing what they're doing. All right? Cannabis plants that are happy are doing this. All right? And cannabis plants that are not so happy are doing this. And cannabis plants that are really unhappy are doing this. All right? And it's just the way it is. I mean, the plant, if the plant looks alert, it's usually doing really well. We have a very poor understanding of cannabis perishability. There are very, very few shelf stability tests being done. It's all I spend my time on these days. My latest patents that you'll hear about a couple years down the road are all about making stuff last without using weird stuff to do it, which is really hard. I love to pressure wash the patchouli off of cannabis. I just think there's an enormous amount of folk nonsense around this plant. And as ridiculous as if you want to stop bad dreams, put a toad under your pillow. I mean, a lot of the information you hear about cannabis is in the same league as that, and it's time for that to end. And the promise of cannabis is vast, but the reality of commercialization is kind of ugly. And a lot of people who really don't understand what they're making are making cannabis products. They're just throwing stuff together and trying to hit a customer in the head and see if it sticks. All right, that's what the problem is. And we just need a little bit more testing, consumer testing. We need regulatory regimes that allow us to test our products with people, because those are the individuals that are going to be using them. And right now, testing cannabis products with human beings is really problematic. And we got to figure out a way around that. And thank you very much.